In the soft twilight of ancient history, where memory blends with wisdom and legend becomes truth, there lived a prince who would discover something precious in the stillness of being alone. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and though he was born into luxury and surrounded by every comfort a person might desire, he felt within himself a restlessness, a quiet calling towards something he could not yet name. The palace walls, gilded and magnificent, began to feel like barriers rather than protection, and the constant presence of courtiers and servants, rather than bringing comfort, seemed to create a kind of noise that drowned out a deeper voice he needed to hear. And so, on a night when the stars hung low and luminous in the sky, this young prince made a choice that would echo through the centuries. He left behind his fine robes and his soft bed, his title and his certainty, and walked out into the world to seek understanding in the one place he had never truly been, alone with himself, alone with the great mysteries of existence. This was not a flight born of anger or fear, but rather a gentle turning towards something essential, like a flower turning toward the sun. He understood in a way that went deeper than thought that the answers to the questions burning in his heart could not be found in the chatter and distraction of palace life, but only in the profound silence of solitude. And so he walked, leaving behind everything familiar, stepping into the unknown with nothing but his intention to understand the nature of suffering, the nature of peace, and the nature of what it means to be truly awake in this world. The path before him was uncertain, winding through forests and across rivers, but with each step away from the noise of the palace, he felt something within him beginning to settle, like silt slowly drifting to the bottom of a clear pond, revealing waters of unexpected depth and clarity. For years, Siddhartha wandered, seeking teachers and practicing disciplines meant to quiet the mind and pierce the veil of ordinary understanding. He sat with ascetics who believed that denying the body would liberate the spirit, and for a time he followed their path with dedicated intensity, eating almost nothing, pushing himself to the very edge of endurance. But even in this extreme solitude, surrounded by others practicing the same austerities, he found that suffering imposed from without did not lead to the peace he sought within. The wisdom he needed would not come through force or through following another's prescription, but through a different kind of aloneness altogether. A solitude not of deprivation, but of patient, gentle attention. And so he came, finally, to a place beside a flowing river, where a great tree spread its sheltering branches wide, its leaves whispering in the evening breeze. This was the Bodhi tree, and beneath its ancient canopy, Siddhartha settled himself on the earth, crossing his legs, straightening his spine, and making a quiet vow to himself. He would sit in this spot, in complete stillness, in complete solitude, until understanding came. Not for a day, not for a week, but for as long as it took. He would turn his attention inward with the patience of the tree itself, which had stood in this place for decades, growing slowly, steadily, without hurry or force. As the sun set and the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Siddhartha sat, breathing slowly, watching the movements of his own mind with gentle curiosity. Thoughts arose like ripples on water, memories, desires, fears, plans, and he simply observed them, neither grasping nor pushing away, allowing each one to appear and dissolve in its own time. Days passed in this way, then weeks, the world continuing around him while he remained still at its center, a point of quiet awareness in the turning of seasons and the cycles of day and night. In this profound aloneness, something remarkable began to happen. In the stillness beneath the Bodhi tree, without the distractions of conversation or the duties of daily life, without even the project of trying to become anything other than what he was in each moment, Siddhartha began to see with extraordinary clarity. He saw how suffering arose from grasping, from the mind's constant reaching toward pleasure and pushing away from pain. He saw how this grasping was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the self and the nature of existence. And in seeing this clearly, completely, without the fog of distraction or the interference of received opinions, something shifted. The understanding that came to him there, in that solitary vigil, was not something he learned from books or teachers, but something discovered in the spaciousness of his own awareness when all the noise finally fell away. They would later call him Buddha, the awakened one, And what he awakened to was found precisely in this embrace of profound solitude, not a lonely isolation, but a rich, full aloneness in which the truth of things could reveal itself without interference. He had discovered something essential, that the deepest insights arise not from accumulating more information or surrounding ourselves with more voices and opinions, but from creating enough quiet space within ourselves that we can finally hear what has been there all along. The solitude beneath the Bodhi tree was not an escape from life, but a diving deeper into its essential nature. And the awakening that came there came because there was finally no distraction from the simple, profound truth of the present moment. When Buddha finally rose from beneath that tree, after days and nights of solitary meditation, he carried with him a teaching born entirely from silence, from aloneness, from the willingness to sit with himself until clarity emerged like the dawn. This ancient story reminds us, gently, that some truths can only be found in solitude, in the quiet spaces where we meet ourselves without the mirrors and echoes of other people's thoughts and expectations. The wisdom of the Bodhi tree is the wisdom of being alone, truly alone, until we discover we have everything we need within the boundaries of our own awareness. Many centuries later, and many miles westward, as the sun blazed over the vast Egyptian desert, another group of seekers discovered the transformative power of solitude in an entirely different landscape. These were the Desert Fathers and Mothers, early Christians who, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, left behind the growing cities and even the organized church communities to venture into the most inhospitable and isolated places they could find, the burning sands and rocky canyons of the desert wilderness. They were seeking something similar to what Buddha had sought beneath his tree, a clarity that could only come from stripping away everything unnecessary, from being alone with the essential questions of existence and spirit. One by one, and then in small scattered groups, these hermits walked out into the emptiness, finding caves in the rock faces or building simple shelters from stone and palm branches, creating for themselves lives of extraordinary solitude. There was Anthony, who spent decades alone in an abandoned fort, wrestling with his own mind and spirit in the silence. There was Mary of Egypt, who lived in complete isolation beyond the Jordan River. There was Syncletica, who taught that just as treasure hidden in a house requires excavation to be found, so the virtues hidden in our souls require the excavation of solitude to be revealed. The desert, with its vast empty spaces and its harsh simplicity, became their monastery, their teacher, their companion. In that landscape where survival itself required attention and discipline, where there was nothing to distract from the movements of one's own heart and mind, these solitary seekers discovered what they called hesychia, a deep inner stillness, a profound quiet that went far beyond the mere absence of noise. Day after day, in the profound silence of sand and stone and sky, they sat with themselves, prayed, contemplated, and gradually learned to hear what could not be heard amid the bustle and chatter of ordinary life. The Desert Fathers and Mothers learned something profound in their solitude, something they expressed in sayings that have come down to us like smooth stones carried by a river through time. They learned that solitude is not primarily about being physically alone, but about achieving a certain quality of inner silence, a stillness of the heart that allows us to see ourselves clearly, without the masks we wear for others, without the stories we tell to make ourselves comfortable. In the desert, there was nowhere to hide from themselves, no entertainment to distract from uncomfortable truths, no other voices to drown out the quiet whispers of conscience and spirit. And in that naked honesty, in that profound aloneness, transformation became possible. The desert, they discovered, was a place of both challenge and gift. Yes, it brought them face to face with their own weaknesses, their wandering minds, their fears and desires, what they called the passions or the demons that needed to be understood and integrated. But it also brought them into a spaciousness, an inner vastness that mirrored the endless sands around them, where the divine could be encountered not as an abstract idea, but as a living presence in the silence. One of the Desert Fathers, Abba Moses, said that the monk must die to his neighbor and never judge him at all, a teaching that could only be truly practiced in solitude, where the habit of judging and comparing falls away because there is no one else to judge, And in that falling away, a kind of freedom emerges, gentle and unexpected. As we leave these ancient seekers to their contemplative silence, Buddha beneath his tree, the hermits in their desert caves, we carry forward a simple but profound understanding that solitude is not a turning away from life, but a turning towards something essential within it, a space where transformation happens slowly, naturally, like seeds germinating in dark earth, like wisdom emerging from silence, like the peace that comes when we finally allow ourselves to be still, to be quiet, to be alone with the truths that have been waiting patiently for us all along. And in this understanding, we begin to settle into our own quiet space, our own moment of solitude, breathing slowly, releasing the day, letting the wisdom of these ancient teachers guide us gently toward rest. As we carry this ancient wisdom forward, breathing slowly, settling deeper into stillness, we now find ourselves traveling through time to medieval Europe, where the practice of solitude became something beautifully structured, intentionally cultivated within walls of stone and silence. The centuries have shifted quietly around us, and we arrive now in an age when solitude was not merely discovered in desert caves, but deliberately built into the very architecture of spiritual life. Imagine with me the rise of monasteries across the European landscape, these sanctuaries of silence appearing like islands of contemplation in a world of constant labor and struggle. Within these walls, a new kind of solitude emerged, one that was communal yet deeply individual, shared yet profoundly private. The monks who inhabited these spaces understood something essential, that solitude need not mean complete isolation from others, but rather a cultivation of inner quiet even while living among a community. They created what we might call structured solitude, a rhythm of silence and stillness woven into the fabric of daily life. Let us walk together now through the quiet corridors of a medieval monastery, our footsteps barely audible on ancient stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of contemplative pacing. The air here is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of beeswax candles and aged wood, the atmosphere itself seeming to invite reflection and calm. In these cloisters, time moves differently, measured not by the frantic pace of worldly concerns, but by the gentle rhythm of bells calling the faithful to prayer, to silence, to solitude. And it was here, in these structured spaces of stillness, that some of the greatest philosophical minds of the medieval age discovered clarity of thought that would illuminate centuries to come. Among these contemplative thinkers, we find Thomas Aquinas, whose massive intellect required vast stretches of uninterrupted silence to do its profound work. Picture him now in his cell, a simple room with stone walls and a narrow window, a writing desk, a candle, and nothing more. For hours upon hours, young Thomas would sit in this solitary space, his mind turning over the deepest questions of existence, faith, and reason. His fellow monks noticed how he would sometimes fall into such deep contemplation that he seemed almost to leave the world entirely, his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of his cell. In this structured solitude, Aquinas created his magnificent Summa Theologica, a work of such systematic brilliance that it still commands respect today, more than 7 centuries after his death. But what's remarkable for us as we settle into our own quiet space tonight is understanding how Aquinas used his solitude. He did not retreat from the world in fear or rejection, but rather withdrew into silence so that he might think more clearly about the world, about God, about the nature of existence itself. His solitude was purposeful, directed, a tool for clarifying thought rather than escaping it. And this structured approach to aloneness, this intentional cultivation of silent space for thinking, became one of the great gifts of the medieval contemplative tradition. The monastery offered something that the busy world could not: uninterrupted time for the mind to follow its deepest questions all the way to their foundations, to think slowly and carefully without the constant pull of distraction. Breathing gently, settling deeper still, we remain in these quiet medieval spaces, but now we turn our attention to a different kind of solitude, one practiced by the mystics who took the contemplative life even further into the realms of profound aloneness. These were individuals who chose not just the communal silence of the monastery, but the more complete solitude of the anchorite's cell, the hermit's enclosure, spaces so small and self-contained that they became entire worlds unto themselves. Let us visit now one of the most remarkable of these contemplative souls, a woman named Julian of Norwich, who lived in 14th century England during a time of plague and upheaval. When she was 30 years old, Julian experienced a series of visions during a serious illness, and these visions so transformed her understanding of divine love that she chose to spend the rest of her life in solitary contemplation, becoming an anchoress, enclosed in a small cell attached to a church. Imagine this cell with me now as we breathe slowly and let our own bodies settle into stillness. Julian's cell was perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, a room with 3 windows, one opening into the church so she could participate in services and receive communion, one opening to the outside world so she could offer counsel to those who sought her wisdom, and one that looked into a small garden, offering her a view of the natural world, of seasons changing, of life continuing its gentle cycles. For more than 40 years, Julian lived in this tiny space, and yet within these confining walls, she discovered a freedom and expansiveness of spirit that few ever find. Her solitude was not imprisonment, but liberation, a chosen withdrawal from the chaos of the world, so that she might attend more fully to the quiet voice of divine love within. And in this sustained, structured solitude, Julian wrote one of the most beautiful and philosophically profound works of medieval mysticism, Revelations of Divine Love. Her words, composed in such complete aloneness, speak of ultimate reassurance and comfort. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. These words, born from solitude, have comforted countless souls across the centuries, a gift that could only emerge from the deep silence of one who had withdrawn from the world long enough to hear its deepest truths. What Julian discovered in her solitary cell was something that resonates with us even now as we rest quietly, that in sustained silence and aloneness, the anxious chatter of our everyday minds begins to settle, and beneath that surface noise, we find something infinitely gentle, infinitely reassuring, a presence of love and peace that was there all along, waiting for us to become still enough to notice it. Her solitude taught her that we are, in our deepest nature, held in a love that will not let us go, and that sometimes we must withdraw from the noise and demands of the world to remember this essential truth. Julian's 40 years in her small cell were not a turning away from life, but a turning toward the very source of life itself, found not in external activity, but in the quiet depths of contemplative awareness. As we breathe gently and rest in the stillness of our own evening solitude, let us meet another remarkable figure from this medieval world of contemplative silence, a German mystic and philosopher named Meister Eckhart, whose profound insights into the nature of solitude and inner silence would influence spiritual thinking for centuries to come. Eckhart was a Dominican friar, a scholar and preacher, but his deepest wisdom came not from his studies or his sermons alone, but from his practice of what he called Gelassenheit, a German word that means something like letting go, or releasement, or profound inner quietness. In the solitude of his contemplative practice, Eckhart discovered something radical and beautiful, that the path to truth required a kind of inner emptiness, a clearing away of all the noise and clutter and constant striving of the ordinary mind. Picture Eckhart in his study, perhaps in the quiet hours before dawn, sitting in silence, not filling his mind with thoughts or prayers or even concepts about God, but rather letting everything fall away, releasing all images and ideas and mental constructions, becoming inwardly still and empty, like a quiet room with no furniture or a clear sky with no clouds. This practice of inner solitude, this cultivation of profound silence within the self, led Eckhart to one of his most startling insights, that in our deepest essence, in the very ground of our being, we are already united with the divine, already at peace, already complete. But we cannot know this truth, cannot experience this essential peace until we become quiet enough, empty enough, alone enough with ourselves to discover it. The outer solitude of his cell and cloister supported this inner solitude, this practice of releasing all the busyness and agitation of ordinary consciousness. Eckhart taught that there is what he called the ground of the soul, a place of absolute stillness and silence within each of us, and that this ground can only be discovered in solitude, in the withdrawal from external things and even from our own internal chatter and striving. As we rest here now, breathing slowly, Perhaps we can sense what Eckhart meant, this possibility of an inner depth that is always quiet, always at peace, beneath all the surface movements of our daily lives. His philosophy of solitude was not about being physically alone, though that certainly helped, but about finding this inner aloneness, this ground of silence that exists prior to all our thoughts and feelings and concerns. And remarkably, Eckhart suggested that this solitary ground of the soul is not lonely or empty in a negative sense, but rather full of presence, radiant, with a quality of being that needs nothing added to it, that is complete in itself. In his solitary contemplations, Eckhart discovered that we spend most of our lives distracted from our own deepest nature, caught up in external pursuits and internal anxieties, and that the practice of solitude, both outer and inner, is really a practice of coming home to ourselves, to that quiet ground where we have always been whole and at peace. His words, written in the stillness of medieval cloisters, speak across the centuries to us now. The soul must withdraw from all outward things and turn totally inward to the inner self. As we settle into sleep tonight, we carry this wisdom with us, this understanding that solitude is not about running away, but about returning home to our own quiet center. Breathing slowly, releasing any remaining tension from the day, we linger a while longer in this medieval world of contemplative solitude, taking time to understand more deeply what these thinkers discovered in their chosen aloneness. The monasteries and solitary cells of medieval Europe were not merely places of religious devotion, though they were certainly that, but they were also laboratories of consciousness, places where dedicated individuals conducted careful experiments in what happens to the human mind and spirit when given sufficient silence and solitude. What they discovered across centuries of contemplative practice was that solitude does something quite specific to human consciousness. It clarifies, it deepens, it reveals. When we remove ourselves from the constant input and demands of social life, when we stop performing for others and responding to their expectations and navigating the complex dynamics of human interaction, something shifts within us. At first, there may be discomfort, a kind of restlessness or anxiety, the mind unused to its own company, still spinning with the momentum of external engagement. But the medieval contemplatives understood that if we persist through this initial discomfort, if we remain in solitude long enough for the mind to settle, something else emerges, a clarity of thought and perception that is almost impossible to achieve in the midst of constant social stimulation. Thomas Aquinas needed hours of uninterrupted silence to follow the long chains of logical reasoning that built his philosophical system. Julian of Norwich needed years in her solitary cell to listen deeply enough to articulate her visions of divine love. Meister Eckhart needed sustained periods of inner emptiness and outer quiet to discover the ground of the soul. Their solitude was not accidental or incidental to their insights. It was the very condition that made those insights possible. Consider what happens in solitude. Without others to perform for, our social masks begin to slip away, and we start to encounter ourselves more directly, more honestly. Without the constant input of others' opinions and perspectives, our own thoughts have room to develop more fully, to follow their own logic rather than conforming to external expectations. Without the endless distractions of social interaction, our attention can go deeper, can stay with a question or a feeling or an insight long enough to truly understand it. The medieval contemplatives structured their entire lives around protecting this space for deep attention, for sustained reflection, for the kind of thinking that cannot be rushed or interrupted. They understood that the most important insights come slowly, emerging from silence the way stars gradually become visible as darkness deepens and our eyes adjust. And perhaps most importantly, they discovered in their solitude a quality of peace that is not dependent on external circumstances, a stillness that exists beneath all the turbulence of life in the world. This was for them both a philosophical discovery and a lived experience, that there is a place within consciousness that is always quiet, always at rest, and that this place becomes accessible to us through the practice of outer and inner solitude. As we rest here now, breathing gently, letting our bodies become heavy and relaxed, we might sense this same truth, that beneath all our daily concerns and anxieties and activities, there is something in us that is already at peace, already home, already complete. The medieval contemplatives devoted their lives to exploring this truth, but they offer it to us freely. That solitude is not loneliness but homecoming, not isolation but deep connection to our own essential nature. As we settle even more deeply now, our breathing becoming slower and more effortless, our bodies releasing fully into rest, we take with us the gentle lessons of these medieval contemplatives, letting their wisdom about solitude become part of our own journey into sleep. The monasteries and mystical cells we have visited tonight were separated from us by centuries, their worlds so different from ours in almost every way. And yet the truths they discovered in their solitude remain remarkably alive, remarkably relevant. They learned that silence is not empty but full of presence and awareness and subtle truth. They learned that solitude is not loneliness but an opportunity for profound self-discovery and clarity of mind. They learned that withdrawal from the constant noise and demands of the world is not escape, but a return to something essential, something that gets lost in the midst of endless activity and distraction. And they learned that this practice of solitude, this cultivation of inner and outer quiet, is not selfish or antisocial, but actually the foundation for genuine wisdom and compassion. Because we can only truly meet others once we have learned to meet ourselves honestly in the stillness of our own company. As we carry these insights with us now, drifting gently towards sleep, we might notice how this very moment partakes of the same quality that the medieval mystics cultivated so intentionally. We are alone with ourselves, quiet, turning inward, releasing the day's demands and expectations, becoming still and receptive. In this way, our nightly passage into sleep is itself a practice of solitude, a brief return to that ground of silence that Meister Eckhart spoke of, that inner stillness where we are always already at peace. The structure the medieval monks created, their rhythms of silence and contemplation, their cells and cloisters designed to support sustained inward attention, these were all in service of something that is available to us even now, even here, in the simple act of lying quietly and letting go. We do not need to withdraw to a monastery or enclose ourselves in an anchorite cell to taste the gifts of solitude. We need only to allow ourselves moments like this one, moments of genuine quiet, when we are not performing or producing or solving or engaging, but simply being, simply resting in our own company, breathing, settling, releasing. The medieval contemplatives would recognize this moment, would honor it as sacred, as an opportunity for that clarifying, deepening, revealing quality of aloneness to do its gentle work within us. And so we rest now, breathing softly, our minds becoming quiet, our bodies growing heavy and relaxed, carrying with us the wisdom of Julian of Norwich, who found in her tiny cell a love that assured her all would be well. The wisdom of Meister Eckhart, who discovered in silence the ground of the soul where we are already complete. The wisdom of Thomas Aquinas, who found in solitary contemplation the clarity to think deeply about the greatest questions of existence. Their solitude and ours meet here, across the centuries, in this simple shared experience of becoming quiet, becoming still, becoming peacefully alone with ourselves, drifting gently now toward sleep, toward that deepest solitude of consciousness where all the noise falls away and we rest in simple being, held in silence, safe in stillness, at peace in the gentle solitude of this night. And as we rest in this gentle solitude of consciousness, our journey through time continues softly forward, carried on quiet currents into a new age of thinking, into centuries where solitude would take on fresh meanings, and where thinkers would venture not into monasteries but into forests, not into desert caves but beside tranquil ponds, not away from nature but deeply into it, seeking in the embrace of the natural world a clarity and independence of mind that had never before been articulated quite this way. We find ourselves now in the 18th century, in the age of enlightenment and the dawning of romanticism, where reason and feeling would meet in forest clearings and on mountain paths, where philosophy would be written not only in quiet studies but on long, solitary walks through countryside and wilderness. Here, in this gentler time of our story, we meet Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher who discovered that his best thinking happened not while sitting at a desk, but while walking alone through the natural world, one foot falling peacefully before the other, his mind freed by the rhythm of his steps. Born in Geneva in 1712, Rousseau would become one of the most influential thinkers of his age, challenging the foundations of society, education, and human nature itself. And he would do much of this revolutionary thinking while walking alone day after day through forests and along country roads, his solitary rambles becoming inseparable from his philosophical insights. Rousseau believed deeply that modern society had corrupted humanity's natural goodness, that civilization with all its complications and conventions had distanced us from our authentic selves. And it was in solitude, particularly in the solitude of nature, that he felt we could reconnect with our true being. He would walk for hours, sometimes entire days, moving through the quiet countryside around Paris or later near the Swiss lakes of his childhood. And in these long periods of walking alone, his mind would open and expand, thoughts flowing as freely as the streams he passed, ideas arranging themselves with the same natural order as the trees in the forest. In his later years, when much of the world had turned against him, when his controversial ideas had made him both famous and friendless, Rousseau retreated even more deeply into solitary walking, and he began writing his Reveries of the Solitary Walker, a series of meditations composed during his rambles, reflecting on memory, nature, happiness, and the profound peace he found in being utterly alone. In these beautiful contemplative writings, he describes the state of mind that walking alone in nature produced in him, a kind of gentle self-forgetfulness, a dissolution of anxious thought, a merging of his consciousness with the landscape around him until he felt himself part of the flowing wholeness of existence, no longer troubled by the opinions of others or the complications of society, just present, just peacefully alive, just walking. He wrote of lying alone on the shore of a lake, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the bank, feeling time itself dissolve into pure sensation, pure being, what he called a state of reverie, where the soul finds a resting place secure enough to establish itself wholly there and gather together its entire being, needing neither to look forward to the future nor back to the past, where time is nothing, where the present lasts forever. This is the gift that Rousseau discovered in solitude, not loneliness but a profound sense of wholeness, not isolation but intimate connection with the natural world, not absence but a fullness of quiet presence that modern life rarely permits us to experience. And as we imagine Rousseau walking those forest paths, his footsteps soft on fallen leaves, the afternoon light filtering gently through the trees, we can almost feel what he felt, that sense of peaceful autonomy, that quiet joy of being alone with our thoughts, alone with the whisper of wind and birdsong, alone in the best possible way, complete unto ourselves, needing nothing but this moment, this breath, this step, and then the next, walking softly forward into deeper stillness, deeper peace, deeper rest. Rousseau's philosophy of solitude would echo forward through time, influencing generations of thinkers who would also seek clarity and truth away from the crowds of civilization. And perhaps nowhere would this influence be felt more powerfully than across the Atlantic Ocean in the young nation of America, where in the 1840s a thoughtful young man named Henry David Thoreau would take Rousseau's insights about solitude and nature and live them even more deliberately, more completely, building himself a small cabin beside a quiet pond and residing there for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, an experiment in essential living that would produce one of the most enduring testaments to the value of solitude ever written. Walden Pond lies in Concord, Massachusetts, a peaceful body of water surrounded by forest. And it was here, on land owned by his friend and mentor Ralph Waldo Emerson, that Thoreau built his simple dwelling in 1845, desiring, as he wrote, to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if he could learn what it had to teach, and not, when he came to die, discover that he had not lived. There is something deeply soothing about imagining Thoreau's life at Walden, the simplicity of it, the quietness, the gentle rhythm of his days shaped not by social obligations or commercial demands, but by sunrise and sunset, by the seasons slowly turning, by the small necessary tasks of living simply and well. He would wake with the dawn and sometimes sit in his doorway from sunrise till noon, lost in reverie, watching the morning light gradually illuminate the pond, observing the movements of birds and the growth of plants, thinking his long thoughts in perfect solitude. He planted a bean field which he tended carefully, not because he needed the income, but because he wanted to know beans, to understand through patient attention and daily labor what it meant to cultivate something, to work with his hands in direct contact with the earth. He walked in the woods nearly every afternoon, covering miles of forest paths, learning the locations of rare plants and the habits of wild creatures, becoming intimate with the landscape in a way that only sustained solitude makes possible. And in the evenings, he would often sit by his cabin, watching the light fade across the pond, the water darkening from blue to silver to black, the stars emerging one by one in perfect silence. And in these quiet hours he would write, recording his observations and reflections, crafting the sentences that would become Walden, a book that reads like a long, patient meditation on the value of simplicity, self-reliance, and solitary communion with nature. Thoreau was not fleeing from the world. Concord Village was only a mile and a half away, and he walked there regularly to visit friends and family, but he was choosing to structure his life around solitude rather than society, around silence rather than conversation, around his own thoughts and observations rather than the second-hand opinions of others. He wrote that he loved to be alone, that he never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude, that we are, for the most part, more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our chambers. In his cabin by the pond, Thoreau discovered what Rousseau had found on his walking paths, that solitude is not deprivation but enrichment, not emptiness but fullness, not turning away from life but turning toward it more completely, with clearer eyes, quieter mind, and deeper attention. He learned that most of what society considers necessary is actually superfluous, that happiness does not require complexity or abundance, but rather simplicity and presence, that one can live richly on very little if one is truly awake to the inexhaustible richness of each moment. His experiment at Walden was, among other things, a demonstration that we need less than we think we do, fewer possessions, fewer distractions, less noise, less company, and that in the spaciousness created by this paring away, something essential emerges, something we might call our true self, unhurried and unperformed, simply being as the trees are, as the pond is, resting in natural existence, peacefully alone, completely sufficient, deeply still. And as we imagine that cabin by the water, smoke rising gently from its chimney into the quiet evening air, we can feel ourselves settling too, needing less, wanting less, just resting here in this moment, in this gentle solitude, breathing slowly, thinking quietly, drifting softly like leaves on still water, toward deeper peace, toward rest. The mentor and friend who had provided Thoreau with the land for his Walden experiment was himself one of the great advocates of solitude in American thought, a man whose essays on self-reliance and the individual soul would shape how generations understood the relationship between solitude and authentic living. Ralph Waldo Emerson, born in Boston in 1803, was a poet, essayist, and philosopher who believed deeply that truth must be discovered by each person individually in quiet reflection, rather than accepted secondhand from tradition or authority. Emerson's path to this philosophy of radical individualism had led him through his own periods of crucial solitude, times when he withdrew from the expectations of society to discover what he truly believed. As a young man, he had been a Unitarian minister, but he found himself unable to continue performing religious ceremonies that had lost their meaning for him. And in 1832, after his young wife's death, he resigned his position, a decision that required tremendous courage and left him without clear direction or purpose. He traveled to Europe, wandering somewhat aimlessly, grieving and searching, and when he returned to America, he settled in Concord, that same quiet town where Thoreau would later build his cabin, and there Emerson began the work of discovering and articulating his own philosophical vision, spending long hours in his study, walking alone through the woods and fields, allowing his thoughts to develop in solitude until they were clear enough to share. The essay for which he is perhaps best known, Self-Reliance, published in 1841, reads like a manifesto for the solitary thinker. An argument that we must trust our own perceptions and insights even when they contradict what everyone around us believes, that conformity and imitation are the death of authentic selfhood, and that true wisdom comes not from books or teachers, but from quiet attention to our own inner voice, our own experience, our own intuition of truth. To believe your own thought, Emerson wrote, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men. That is genius. This is a philosophy that requires solitude to practice, because it asks us to separate ourselves from the constant pressure of social opinion, from the temptation to simply adopt the beliefs of our community or our time, and instead to sit alone with our own perceptions until we know what we truly think, what we truly value, what we truly are. Emerson understood that society conspires against the selfhood of every one of its members, that we are constantly pressured to conform, to smooth our rough edges, to become interchangeable and predictable, and that only in solitude can we resist this pressure and remain faithful to our own nature. He wrote of walking in nature as a spiritual practice, describing how when he went out into the woods, standing on the bare ground with his head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanished. He became a transparent eyeball, nothing and seeing all. The currents of universal being circulated through him, and he was part and parcel of God. This mystical experience of dissolution and unity, so similar to what Rousseau described in his Reveries, came to Emerson specifically in moments of solitude, when he stepped away from social roles and obligations and allowed himself to simply be present to existence itself. His philosophy of self-reliance was never about isolation or misanthropy. Emerson was a sociable man who maintained warm friendships and spoke regularly to large audiences, but it insisted that genuine relationship and community can only be built by individuals who have first done the solitary work of discovering who they actually are, what they actually believe, unmediated by the expectations or opinions of others. In his study, surrounded by books but fundamentally alone with his thoughts, Emerson developed ideas that would encourage countless people to trust their own experience, to value their own insights, to find in quiet self-reflection the authority that previous generations had sought in churches or kings. He taught that we each contain within ourselves access to the same universal truths that prophets and sages have proclaimed, that we need not wait for someone else to tell us what to think or how to live, that in the silence of our own consciousness, in the solitude of honest self-examination, we can discover what is real and what matters. And there is something so restful about this philosophy, something that invites us to relax into ourselves, to stop performing and defending and proving, to just be quietly who we are, alone with our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own steady presence, trusting that this is enough, that we are enough, that in the solitude of our own being we have everything we need to understand what we need to understand, at least for now, at least for this moment, breathing gently here in the quiet darkness, resting in the sufficiency of simple existence, peacefully alone, peacefully ourselves, peacefully drifting now towards sleep. What united these three thinkers, Rousseau walking his forest paths, Thoreau dwelling by his pond, Emerson writing in his study, was a shared conviction that solitude in nature offered something that society could not provide, a clarity of perception, an authenticity of being, a kind of wisdom that emerges only when we step away from the noise and expectations of human civilization and allow ourselves to exist more simply, more quietly, more naturally. They understood that nature itself is a kind of solitude, a vast presence that asks nothing of us, judges nothing about us, simply exists in its own rhythms and patterns, indifferent to our anxieties and ambitions, and that when we enter this natural solitude with open attention, we begin to absorb something of its peace, its patience, its unhurried wholeness. Rousseau found that walking through forests and along lake shores allowed his mind to unhook from the tangled complications of social life, from the resentments and misunderstandings that plagued his relationships, and to settle instead into the simple sensory present. The feeling of his feet on the path, the sound of leaves rustling, the play of light on water, until gradually his sense of self would loosen and expand, no longer bounded by the tight, anxious ego that society had created, but diffusing into something larger, calmer, more peaceful. Thoreau discovered at Walden that living close to nature, with his cabin door opening directly onto forest and pond, with his days shaped by weather and season rather than clock and calendar, allowed him to perceive realities that are invisible in towns and cities, the subtle language of bird calls, the exact moment when ice begins to melt, the way light changes quality as days lengthen towards summer. And through this sustained attention to natural processes, he developed a different sense of time itself, not as something scarce and urgent, but as something abundant and cyclical. Not as a resource to be managed, but as a medium in which to exist, as fish exist in water, unhurried and appropriate. Emerson experienced in his solitary walks a dissolution of the boundaries between self and world, a mystical merging where he was no longer Ralph Waldo Emerson, citizen and thinker, but simply consciousness itself, witnessing without separation the flowing presence of existence, trees and sky and wind all part of one seamless whole, himself included in that wholeness, held by it, at home in it. All three understood that this experience, this particular quality of awareness and being that nature solitude provides, is not a luxury or an indulgence, but something essential to human well-being, something we need the way we need sleep or nourishment, a periodic return to simplicity, silence, and natural rhythm that allows us to remain sane and whole in the midst of complicated social existence. They recognize that civilization, for all its benefits, tends to fragment our attention, divide our loyalties, distance us from direct experience by interposing endless layers of convention, opinion, and mediation between ourselves and reality, and that only by regularly withdrawing into solitude, particularly into natural solitude, can we maintain contact with something essential, something true, something deeply restful. Modern life has accelerated far beyond what any of these thinkers could have imagined. The noise and distraction they fled would seem like profound silence compared to our current condition, and yet their insights remain perfectly relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever. Their invitation to seek regular solitude in nature, still offering the same gifts of clarity and peace, still providing the same opportunity to remember who we are beneath all the roles and expectations, still creating the same spaciousness where authentic thought and feeling can emerge. When Thoreau wrote that he went to the woods because he wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, he was articulating something every age needs to hear, a reminder that we can choose to organize our lives differently, that we need not accept the default patterns that society offers, that we can carve out time and space for what actually matters, for silence, for nature, for being alone with our own consciousness, unhurried and undistracted. When Emerson urged self-reliance, he was not promoting selfishness, but rather inviting each person to take responsibility for their own thinking, to develop their own relationship with truth, to trust what they discover in quiet reflection rather than simply accepting what they are told. When Rousseau described his reveries by the lake, entering a state where time seemed to stop and the soul rested in pure being, he was pointing toward an experience available to anyone who creates the conditions for it. Solitude, nature, unhurried time, open attention. These are simple elements requiring no special knowledge or equipment, just the willingness to step away, to be alone, to be quiet, to allow the natural world to work its gentle medicine on our overstimulated minds and hearts. And perhaps we can feel that medicine working even now, here in the solitude of this night, as we imagine those forest paths and quiet ponds, as we breathe slowly and rest in stillness, as we allow ourselves to just be without agenda or effort, like the pond at evening, darkening and deepening, perfectly still, reflecting stars, held in silence, safe in solitude, drifting softly towards sleep. As we rest here in the quiet darkness, having walked with Rousseau through his forests, having sat with Thoreau beside his pond, having stood with Emerson in the woods beneath infinite space, we can begin to gather the gentle lessons these thinkers discovered in their solitude, lessons that connect backward to the hermits and mystics we met earlier in our journey and forward to the philosophers we will soon encounter. Lessons that repeat themselves across centuries and cultures because they touch something fundamental about human consciousness and what it needs to flourish. Solitude in nature, these thinkers showed us, is not about escaping from life, but about learning to live more fully, more authentically, more peacefully, about stripping away the unnecessary complications and distractions that accumulate like dust on our perception until we can hardly see clearly or feel truly. It is about remembering that we are not just social beings, not just economic beings, not just thinking beings, but also natural beings, part of the larger wholeness of existence, subject to the same cycles of day and night, growth and rest, activity and stillness that govern all living things. When we spend time alone in nature, we realign ourselves with these deeper rhythms, we remember our place in the larger pattern, we receive permission to slow down, to simplify, to just be present without constantly performing or producing or proving our worth. The independence of thought that both Thoreau and Emerson championed, that quality of self-reliance that allows us to trust our own perceptions and develop our own understanding, grows naturally from solitude, because only when we are alone, free from the immediate pressure of others' expectations and opinions, can we hear our own inner voice clearly enough to know what we actually think, what we actually value, what we actually believe. This does not mean we reject all guidance or wisdom from others, but rather that we process everything through our own experience and reflection, that we take responsibility for our own conclusions rather than simply adopting what we are told. And there is something deeply restful about this taking of responsibility, this quiet claiming of our own authority, because it means we can stop performing for others. Stop trying to be what we imagine they want us to be, and simply settle into our own nature, our own truth, our own steady presence, knowing that this is sufficient, that we are enough, that in the solitude of our own being we have access to everything we need. The peace that Rousseau described in his Reveries, that state of being where time seems to stop and the soul rests in pure existence, is perhaps the deepest gift of solitude. And it is available whenever we create the conditions for it. Whenever we step away from demands and distractions, whenever we allow ourselves to just be without agenda or effort, whenever we open our attention to the present moment with all its simple richness, the feeling of breath, the quality of light, the sound of silence. This peace is not the peace of having solved all our problems or achieved all our goals, but rather the peace of letting go of the need to constantly solve and achieve, the peace of resting in being rather than doing, the peace of accepting this moment exactly as it is, accepting ourselves exactly as we are, without resistance, without striving, just peacefully present, peacefully alive, peacefully here. As we move forward in our journey through time, we will meet other solitary thinkers who discovered similar truths through different paths, philosophers who withdrew from society not into forests but into cities, who sought not nature's peace but philosophy's clarity, and yet who found in solitude the same essential gifts: the space to think deeply, the freedom to question everything, the courage to stand alone with unpopular truths. But for now, here at the end of this gentle chapter about nature and self-reliance, about forest paths and quiet ponds and starlit walks, we can simply rest in the peacefulness these images evoke, allowing ourselves to feel what Rousseau and Thoreau and Emerson felt, that sense of sufficiency and wholeness that comes from being alone in nature, that quiet joy of existing without complication, without performance, without anything to prove or protect, just breathing, just being, just resting here in the solitude of this night, in the stillness of this moment, our minds growing quieter now, our bodies growing heavier now, our thoughts drifting like leaves on water, settling softly, releasing gently, everything slowing, everything softening, everything becoming peaceful and still and quiet, held in the gentle embrace of solitude, wrapped in the comforting darkness, sinking slowly into rest, into sleep, into that deepest natural solitude where consciousness itself grows dim and we dissolve into pure being, pure peace, pure rest, breathing slowly, thinking softly, drifting gently now, peacefully alone, peacefully whole, peacefully still, settling into sleep like a bird settling into its nest at evening, like water becoming perfectly calm after wind has passed, like all of nature resting in the quiet darkness, safe, still, deeply peaceful, drifting now, releasing now, sleeping now, held in solitude, held in silence, held in the gentle peace of this night. And so we rest in that peaceful stillness for a moment longer, held in the gentle darkness, before we move quietly forward through time, drifting now into the 19th century, into an age of profound transformation and questioning, where the individual human being began to stand forth from the crowd, alone, and questioning everything that had been taken for granted before. We find ourselves in Copenhagen, in the quiet streets of Denmark's capital city, where a solitary figure walks alone through the evening, his shadow long in the lamplight, his mind turning over questions that would change the nature of philosophy itself. His name is Søren Kierkegaard, and he is perhaps the loneliest of all the great thinkers we have met on our journey. A man who chose isolation not as retreat, but as the only honest place from which to examine what it means to be a single, separate, conscious self in this vast universe. Feel yourself walking with him now through these quiet streets, the cobblestones smooth beneath your feet, the air cool and still, the city settling into its evening rhythms as Kierkegaard walks alone, thinking, always thinking, in the solitude that defines his existence. He was born in 1813, this Danish philosopher, into a wealthy family shadowed by melancholy, by religious anxiety, by a father who passed on to him a sense of sin and burden that colored all his days. But it was in his chosen solitude that Kierkegaard found his voice, writing prolifically in his rooms, breaking off his engagement to the woman he loved because he believed marriage would compromise the isolation necessary for his philosophical work. He wrote under many pseudonyms, creating different voices to explore different possibilities of existence. But always he returned to the central question: what does it mean to be an individual, a single self, making choices in a world that wants to dissolve you into the crowd, into the mass, into comfortable conformity? In his solitude, Kierkegaard developed the concept of the authentic self, the idea that each person must make what he called a leap of faith into their own existence, choosing who they will be rather than accepting who others expect them to be. He wrote of 3 stages of life: the aesthetic, where we pursue pleasure and distraction; the ethical, where we accept duty and responsibility; and the religious, where we make that great leap into faith and authentic selfhood. And all of this thinking, all these revolutionary ideas about individual existence, about anxiety and choice and the courage required to be truly yourself, all of it came from his solitary walks, his solitary writing, his willingness to remain alone with the most difficult questions. Let yourself rest in this understanding now, feeling the peace of knowing that solitude can be not just a refuge, but a place of profound self-discovery where you meet yourself truly, without the masks and performances that company so often requires. Kierkegaard walked alone, and in that walking found truths that still resonate, still matter, still speak to anyone who has ever felt separate, alone, questioning, searching for authentic meaning in a world of easy answers and comfortable illusions. Breathe gently now, resting in this knowledge, feeling yourself held in the same solitude that held Kierkegaard, that made space for his deepest thinking, his most honest questions, his revolutionary understanding of what it means to be a conscious individual choosing your own path through existence. We remain in this century of questioning, this age of solitary thinkers, but we drift now from Copenhagen to Frankfurt, from the streets of Denmark to the rooms of Germany, where another solitary philosopher lived an even more reclusive existence, a man who made withdrawal from the world not just a practice but a philosophical principle, a core teaching of his entire system of thought. His name is Arthur Schopenhauer, and he lived from 1788 to 1860, spending most of his adult life alone in his Frankfurt apartment with only his beloved poodle for company, avoiding human society with deliberate intention, finding in that avoidance a kind of peace that the world of human striving could never provide. Feel yourself entering his quiet rooms now, the furniture simple and orderly, the windows looking out onto the city, but the philosopher himself turned inward, away from the noise and chaos of human desire, towards something deeper, something calmer, something he called the will to live and taught us to quiet through contemplation and withdrawal. Schopenhauer was a profoundly pessimistic philosopher, but his pessimism had a strange peace at its center, a gentle acceptance of suffering that led not to despair but to a kind of serene detachment. He believed that all of life is suffering because all of life is driven by will, by wanting, by endless desire that can never be permanently satisfied. We want, we strive, we achieve, and then immediately we want something else. And so the wheel of suffering turns endlessly, generation after generation, each of us driven by forces we barely understand toward goals that cannot bring lasting happiness. But Schopenhauer found an answer to this predicament, and the answer was solitude, withdrawal, the deliberate quieting of desire through contemplation and aesthetic experience. In his solitary room, surrounded by his books and his music, Schopenhauer practiced what he preached, a turning away from the world of striving toward the world of pure perception, of art, of philosophy, where the will becomes quiet and we experience brief moments of peace, of stillness, of freedom from want. He would walk alone each afternoon, the same route through Frankfurt, returning to eat alone, to read alone, to think alone, and in that aloneness he found the closest thing to happiness that his philosophy allowed, the absence of desire, the peace of contemplation, the stillness of a mind no longer grasping and wanting, but simply observing, simply being, simply resting in awareness. Let yourself feel that stillness now, that peace of wanting nothing, needing nothing, simply resting in the quiet awareness of this moment, breathing gently, releasing all striving, all anxiety, all the restless energy that drives us through our days. Schopenhauer taught that in solitude we can step off the wheel of wanting, if only temporarily, if only for blessed moments of peace like this one, where nothing is required of you, nothing is demanded, and you can simply be, simply rest, simply exist without purpose or goal or destination, held in the gentle darkness, safe in your solitude, calm in your withdrawal from the noise and chaos of the world beyond these moments of peace. And now we climb higher, leaving the city behind, ascending into the mountains, into the thin, clear air of the Alps, where our journey through 19th century solitude reaches its peak, both literally and philosophically, in the isolated figure of Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps the most radical of all the thinkers we have met, a man whose profound aloneness was both his greatest suffering and the source of his most revolutionary ideas. Feel yourself climbing now, higher and higher, the air growing cooler and thinner, the world falling away below, until you reach the alpine villages where Nietzsche spent his summers, alone in simple rented rooms, his health failing, his eyesight poor, his body racked with pain, but his mind soaring to heights that few philosophers have ever reached, thinking thoughts that would echo through the 20th century and beyond. Nietzsche was born in 1844 and died in 1900, but his productive life was much shorter, ending in mental collapse in 1889, and nearly all of his major works were written in profound solitude, in these mountain retreats where he walked alone for hours each day, thinking, composing in his mind the passages he would later write in his cramped, nearly illegible hand. He had few friends, fewer visitors, and long periods where he spoke to almost no one, alone with his thoughts in a way that most people would find unbearable, but which for him became the necessary condition for philosophical breakthrough. In his solitude, Nietzsche questioned everything, challenged every comfortable belief, every received wisdom, every traditional value of European culture. He declared the death of God, by which he meant the collapse of the traditional religious and moral framework that had given meaning to Western civilization for nearly 2,000 years. And in the absence of those old certainties, in the void left by their collapse, Nietzsche asked, how shall we live? What shall we value? Who shall we become? And his answer in the profound isolation of his alpine solitude was that we must create our own values, overcome our own limitations, they'll become who we truly are, through a process he called self-overcoming, a constant striving to surpass ourselves, to grow beyond what we have been, to embrace life fully despite its suffering, even to love our fate, to say yes to existence in all its pain and beauty and terrible glory. He called this amor fati, the love of fate, and he developed the concept of eternal return, the idea that we should live as if we would have to live this same life over and over again forever, and that the highest achievement would be to desire exactly that, to want nothing changed, to embrace every moment so fully that we would will its eternal repetition. These are not comfortable ideas, not soothing thoughts, and yet there is something deeply peaceful in them, something restful in this acceptance, this saying yes, this embrace of life as it is. And all of this came from solitude, From Nietzsche's willingness to be profoundly alone, to walk his mountain paths with no companion but his own thoughts, to sit in his simple rooms and think through to the end every difficult question, every uncomfortable truth, every revolutionary possibility. Let yourself rest in this now, feeling the thin mountain air, the vast silence of the peaks, the peace that comes from having questioned everything and arrived at acceptance, at affirmation, at a deep yes to existence despite everything, because of everything, embracing it all in this moment of gentle stillness, breathing slowly, releasing into sleep, held in the same alpine solitude that held Nietzsche, that made space for his greatest thoughts, his deepest truths. Rest here in the mountains a while longer, breathing the clear air, feeling the peace of these heights where Nietzsche walked and thought and discovered what he called the philosophy of the future, a way of thinking that begins from solitude, from the willingness to be alone with difficult truths, from the courage to question everything and create meaning in a universe that offers no guarantees, no cosmic purpose, no predetermined path. It is a philosophy of freedom, but freedom of the most demanding kind, the freedom that comes from accepting complete responsibility for your own existence, your own choices, your own values and meaning. And yet, wrapped in this demanding philosophy is a strange comfort, a deep permission to be exactly who you are, to stop pretending, stop conforming, stop living according to values you never truly chose. Nietzsche wrote of becoming who you are, of finding your own path, of listening to what he called the voice of your true self rather than the voice of the crowd, the herd, the comfortable majority who never question, never risk, never truly live. And he found this voice in solitude, in the long, quiet hours of walking and thinking, where no one else's expectations could reach him, where he was accountable only to his own highest understanding, his own deepest truth. Feel yourself in that same space now. Alone but not lonely, solitary but not isolated, simply present with yourself in the most honest way possible, without performance or pretense, without the need to be anything other than exactly what you are in this moment, breathing gently, resting deeply, allowing all the questions to settle, all the seeking to pause, all the striving to cease for now, for these peaceful moments of rest and restoration. Nietzsche spent much of his life in pain, physical and emotional, struggling with illness, with misunderstanding, with the profound loneliness that comes from thinking thoughts too far ahead of your time for most people to comprehend. But in that pain and solitude, he found something valuable, something worth sharing, a message that has reached across the decades to touch millions, that life can be affirmed despite its suffering, that meaning can be created through our own choices and commitments, that each of us has the potential to overcome our limitations and become something greater than we have been. This is the gift of his solitude, the fruit of all those lonely hours in alpine meadows and simple rooms, thinking through to the end the hardest questions philosophy can ask. And now you carry this gift with you as you drift deeper into rest, deeper into the peace of your own solitude, knowing that alone is where we meet ourselves most truly, where we discover what we actually think rather than what we have been told to think, where we find the courage to become who we really are beneath all the layers of expectation and habit and social conditioning. Let Nietzsche's mountain solitude blend now with your own quiet rest, the alpine air becoming the air of your own bedroom, the silence of the peaks becoming the silence of this night, peaceful, deep, holding you safely as you release into sleep, carrying with you the wisdom of this solitary philosopher who climbed so high and saw so far and left us the gift of his difficult, beautiful, liberating ideas, born from aloneness, shaped by solitude, offered now to your dreaming mind as you rest, as you settle, as you sleep. And so we have climbed through this century of solitary thinkers, meeting Kierkegaard in his Copenhagen solitude, finding the truth of individual existence and authentic selfhood, visiting Schopenhauer in his Frankfurt withdrawal, discovering the peace that comes from quieting desire and stepping away from the wheel of wanting, and ascending with Nietzsche to his alpine heights, embracing the freedom and responsibility of creating our own meaning in a vast and silent universe. 3 philosophers, 3 very different approaches to solitude, but all of them finding in their aloneness something essential, something that could not be discovered any other way. The truth of who they were, the depth of what they thought, the courage to challenge everything and forge new paths forward. Feel yourself holding all three now, carrying their wisdom into your own solitude, understanding that being alone is not something to fear, but something to embrace. A space where you can be most fully yourself, most honest, most free from the expectations and judgments that surround us in the social world. Each of these thinkers was misunderstood in his lifetime. Each struggled with loneliness and pain. Each paid a price for his isolation, and yet each one found in that isolation something precious, something that enriched not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who would later encounter his ideas. This is the paradox of solitary philosophy, that the person who withdraws from society often has the most important things to say to society, that the one who stands alone can sometimes see most clearly what everyone together has missed. And you do not need to be a great philosopher to benefit from this wisdom, to discover what solitude offers anyone willing to embrace it. The clarity that comes from silence, the self-knowledge that emerges from introspection, the creativity that flourishes when we stop consuming other people's thoughts and make space for our own thoughts to arise. Let yourself feel that space now, that generous emptiness where your own truth can emerge, where you can hear your own voice beneath all the noise, where you can rest in your own being without needing to explain or justify or perform for anyone else. The 19th century gave us these great individualists, these champions of authentic selfhood and solitary seeking, and their gift to us is permission to be alone, to value our alone time, to seek out silence and solitude as essential nutrients for the soul, as necessary as food and water for the body. Breathe into that permission now, releasing any guilt or anxiety about needing time alone, understanding that solitude is where we become most fully human, most completely ourselves, most deeply at peace. Feel yourself settling like these philosophers settled into their routines of solitude, Kierkegaard into his evening walks, Schopenhauer into his afternoon ritual, Nietzsche into his mountain rambles, each finding a rhythm that honored his need for aloneness, for quiet, for the space to think and feel and simply be without interruption. You are finding that same rhythm now, settling into your own peaceful solitude, your own quiet darkness, your own deep rest, breathing slowly, releasing completely, drifting now into sleep as the wisdom of these solitary thinkers wraps around you like a soft blanket, keeping you safe, holding you gently, reminding you that alone is beautiful, solitude is precious, and in this quiet darkness you are exactly where you need to be, exactly who you need to be, perfect and complete in this moment of peaceful solitary rest, sleeping now, dreaming now, held in the gentle wisdom of those who walked before you in solitude and found it good, found it true, found it the pathway to their deepest understanding and their greatest gifts to the world. As you rest, as you sleep, as you drift into dreams, peaceful, solitary, deeply at rest. And so we arrive at this quiet place, this moment of gentle synthesis, where all the wisdom of those who came before us in solitude gathers like soft light at the close of day. From Buddha beneath his tree to Nietzsche in his mountain retreat, from desert hermits to woodland philosophers, each discovered something essential in the stillness, something true in the silence, something profoundly valuable in being alone. And now, in your own quiet moment, their discoveries become available to you, settling around you like a warm blanket, like the softest twilight, like the gentlest understanding that solitude is not emptiness but fullness, not absence but presence, not loneliness but a kind of homecoming to yourself. Let us gather these insights together now, slowly, peacefully, allowing each truth to rest in your awareness like a smooth stone placed carefully in still water, creating gentle ripples that expand and then fade into perfect calm. The first gift that solitude offers, the first wisdom that all these thinkers discovered, is clarity. In the noise and rush of constant company, constant stimulation, constant demands, the mind becomes like a pond disturbed by wind, its surface rippling and unclear, unable to reflect the sky, unable to show the depths below. But in solitude, in quiet, in the absence of external demands, the waters begin to still. Slowly, gradually, the ripples fade, the disturbances settle, and the mind becomes clear like a mountain lake at dawn, perfectly reflective, perfectly transparent. Buddha found this clarity beneath the Bodhi tree, watching his thoughts arise and pass away like clouds across an open sky. The Desert Fathers found it in their caves, where silence polished their awareness until it shone like a mirror. Thoreau found it at Walden, writing that in solitude he could hear himself think, could distinguish his own thoughts from the thoughts others had placed in his mind like seeds that had taken root without his choosing. This clarity is available to you now in this quiet darkness, in this peaceful rest. You need not chase it or grasp for it. Simply by being here, by allowing yourself this time apart, this time alone, this time of gentle withdrawal from the world's demands, clarity begins to emerge naturally, effortlessly, like stars appearing as the sky darkens, like your own breath finding its natural rhythm when you stop trying to control it. Let yourself rest in this clarity now, this gentle, peaceful knowing that comes from stillness, this quiet wisdom that emerges when the noise falls away and you can finally hear the soft voice of your own deepest understanding, whispering truths you have always known but perhaps forgotten in the busyness of days. Clarity comes in solitude. Clarity rests in silence. Clarity is here with you now as you breathe slowly, as you settle more deeply, as you allow the world to fade and your own inner knowing to gently illuminate your awareness like the softest lamplight in a quiet room at the end of a long day. The second gift of solitude, the second precious discovery made by those who embraced being alone, is creativity. Not the forced, anxious creativity of deadlines and demands, but the natural, flowing creativity that emerges like a spring from deep underground when we give ourselves space and silence and unhurried time. Rousseau discovered this on his long, solitary walks where ideas would come to him unbidden, arising naturally from the rhythm of his steps and the quiet contemplation of trees and sky. Nietzsche found it in his alpine retreats, where the thin mountain air and the vast silence seemed to open channels in his mind through which new thoughts could flow like water finding its course down a mountainside. Emerson wrote that the soul becomes creative in proportion to its solitude, that original thinking requires withdrawal from the well-worn paths of conventional ideas, from the constant reinforcement of what everyone already believes and thinks and says. In solitude, we step off those paths. We wander into unmarked territory. We allow our minds to make unusual connections, to notice what others overlook, to combine familiar elements in unfamiliar ways. The creative mind is like a garden that needs both planting and space to grow. In constant company, we do much planting, receiving seeds of ideas from others, from conversations, from the endless stream of inputs and stimuli, but we rarely give those seeds space to germinate, to send down roots, to grow into something uniquely ours. Solitude provides that space. In quiet, in aloneness, in the gentle absence of external voices, the seeds planted in our consciousness begin to sprout and grow, nourished by our own attention, shaped by our own unique way of seeing and understanding. Thomas Aquinas knew this, structuring his days with long periods of silent contemplation between his studies. The medieval mystics knew this, finding that their most profound visions came in their solitary cells, not in the chapel among others. And you can feel this creative potential even now, even as you rest, as you let go, as you allow yourself this time apart. Your mind, freed from its usual tasks and demands, begins to wander, to drift, to make connections that daylight and busyness would never permit. Ideas float by like clouds, images arise and dissolve. Memories combine with imaginings in strange and beautiful ways. This is the creativity of solitude, not forced but allowed, not grasped but received, not manufactured but discovered in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the gentle emptiness that is not empty at all but full of potential, full of possibility, full of the seeds of new understanding waiting to take root and grow in their own time, in their own way, nurtured by your attention, by your patience, by your willingness to be alone with yourself and see what emerges from the depths, what rises from the silence like a gift you didn't know you were waiting for. The third treasure that solitude offers, the third profound discovery made by philosophers across centuries, is self-knowledge. Know thyself, the ancient Greeks inscribed on their temple at Delphi. But how can we know ourselves when we are constantly defining ourselves in relation to others, constantly performing the roles that society assigns, constantly adjusting our behavior to meet expectations, to avoid conflict, to maintain harmony, to be acceptable, to be liked, to be approved of? Kierkegaard understood this dilemma deeply, writing that the crowd is untruth, that in the mass of others we lose our individual essence, that only in solitude can we encounter our authentic self, the self beneath the masks and roles and performances. Schopenhauer argued that we can only truly know our own will, our own desires and aversions, when we withdraw from the influence of others, from their judgments and opinions that cloud our self-perception like fog obscuring a mirror. In solitude, the fog begins to lift. Alone, we discover what we actually think, not what we think we should think. We learn what we genuinely feel, not what we believe we ought to feel. We encounter our true preferences, our real values, our authentic responses to the world, unfiltered by the need to conform or please or fit in. This self-knowledge is not always comfortable. Sometimes, in quiet and alone, we meet aspects of ourselves we would rather not acknowledge, shadows and contradictions, fears and longings we usually keep hidden even from ourselves. But the philosophers of solitude understood that this uncomfortable self-knowledge is essential, that we cannot live authentically without first knowing who we actually are, beneath the layers of social conditioning and assumed identity. Buddha sat with himself until he understood the nature of his own mind, the patterns of grasping and aversion that created suffering. The Christian hermits faced themselves in the desert, confronting what they called demons, but what we might understand as the difficult truths about human nature, about desire and ego and the endless tricks the mind plays to avoid seeing clearly. And this self-knowledge need not be harsh or judgmental. It can be gentle, accepting, compassionate. As you rest here in your own solitude in this quiet darkness, you can meet yourself with kindness, noticing your thoughts without condemning them, observing your feelings without needing to change them, simply being with yourself as you are, not as you think you should be. This is the deep peace that comes from self-knowledge, from no longer hiding from yourself, from no longer performing even in your own mind. Just resting, just being, just allowing yourself to be known by yourself, the way the ocean knows its own depths, the way the earth knows what grows in its soil, the way the night sky knows every star that shines in its vast darkness. Self-knowledge in solitude, self-acceptance in quiet, self-compassion in the gentle space of being alone and finding that aloneness not frightening but friendly, not empty but intimate, not isolating but somehow the deepest connection possible. The connection with your own true nature, your own authentic being, your own irreplaceable self. The fourth gift, perhaps the most precious, is peace. Deep peace. Lasting peace. The peace that comes not from having everything you want, but from being comfortable with yourself, from no longer constantly seeking external validation, from finding sufficiency in your own company, from discovering that you are enough, that this moment is enough, that simply being alive and aware is enough. More than enough. A miracle if we could only pause long enough to notice. Every philosopher we have visited on this gentle journey discovered this peace in their solitude. Not immediately, not always easily, but eventually, gradually, through patient sitting with themselves, through accepting the silence instead of fleeing it, through making friends with their aloneness instead of treating it as a problem to solve. Thoreau found it at Walden, writing that he never found a companion as companionable as solitude, that in being alone he was somehow least alone, most connected to everything, to the pond and the woods and the succession of seasons, to the deep rhythms of existence that the noise of society usually drowns out. Emerson found it in nature, in quiet observation, in the understanding that we are not separate from the world but part of its great unfolding, and that in solitude we can feel this connection more clearly than in any crowd. The peace of solitude is different from the peace of companionship, though both have their place and value. The peace of companionship comes from being known and accepted by another. The peace of solitude comes from accepting yourself, from knowing that you can be alone without being lonely, that your own presence is sufficient, that you need not constantly distract yourself or entertain yourself or escape from yourself. Just being here, just breathing quietly, just existing in this moment without needing it to be different, without needing to be different, without needing anything at all except what is already here, already present, already enough. This peace settles over you now like snow falling softly on a winter night, silent and gentle, covering everything with quiet whiteness, muffling all sound, creating a hush that feels sacred somehow, feels holy. Feels like the world pausing to rest, to be still, to simply exist without purpose or plan or effort. You can feel this peace in your body now, can you not? The softness in your shoulders, the quiet in your breath, the stillness spreading through your limbs like warmth, like comfort, like coming home after a long journey to find everything just as it should be, welcoming and familiar and safe. The peace of solitude is here with you. The peace that Buddha knew under his tree, that the desert hermits knew in their caves, that every philosopher of aloneness discovered and tried to describe in their writings, knowing that words could only point toward this experience, could never fully capture it, could never replace the direct knowing that comes from simply being alone, being quiet, being still, being at peace with yourself and with the great mystery of existence, at peace with not knowing all the answers, at peace with uncertainty, at peace with impermanence, at peace with change, at peace with life as it actually is, rather than how you wish it would be. And so we come to rest here, at the end of our journey through the philosophy of solitude, carrying with us the wisdom of centuries, the insights of great thinkers who all discovered that being alone is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Not a lack, but a fullness. Not emptiness, but richness. Not isolation, but a kind of connection that goes deeper than words, deeper than company, deeper than anything the busy world can offer. You carry this wisdom with you now as you rest, as you breathe, as you settle more and more deeply into peaceful sleep. The clarity of solitude is yours, the creativity of quiet time is yours, the self-knowledge of introspection is yours, the peace of comfortable aloneness is yours. These gifts do not belong to the past, to distant philosophers in distant times. They belong to you here now, in this very moment of gentle rest. Buddha's tree is your tree. The hermit's cave is your quiet room. Thoreau's cabin is your peaceful solitude. Nietzsche's mountain is your own height of understanding. All of it available, all of it here, all of it offered freely to anyone who pauses, who rests, who allows themselves to be alone and finds it good, finds it nourishing, finds it necessary and beautiful and true. As you drift now toward sleep, toward dreams, toward the deep rest your body and mind need and deserve, you can let go of any remaining sense that you should be doing something, should be with someone, should be other than exactly where you are. The philosophers of solitude give you permission if you need it, to be alone, to be quiet, to be still, to rest without guilt, to sleep without anxiety, to simply exist in peaceful solitude, held by the darkness, cradled by the silence, supported by the great wisdom of those who walked this path before you and found it led to understanding, to creativity, to peace, to truth. Your breath is slow now, so slow and gentle, like waves on a distant shore, regular and rhythmic and soothing. Your body is heavy now, so heavy and comfortable, sinking into softness, letting go of tension, releasing the day and all its demands. Your mind is quiet now, so quiet and spacious, thoughts drifting by like clouds across a vast sky, noticed and released, leaving only awareness, only presence, only this peaceful moment of rest. Sleep comes naturally in solitude, in quiet, in the gentle embrace of being alone and safe and at peace. Let it come now. Let it arrive like an old friend, like a familiar comfort, like the most natural thing in the world. The great thinkers rest with you. Their wisdom surrounds you like starlight, like the gentle knowing that solitude is sacred, that quiet is holy, that you are exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you need to do, which is nothing at all except rest, except sleep, except drift into dreams carrying the peace of centuries, the clarity of silence, the creativity of stillness, the self-knowledge of solitude, all of it yours now, all of it here, all of it gentle and soft and peaceful as you sleep, as you dream, as you rest in the wisdom of aloneness, deeply, completely, perfectly at peace. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story helped you drift off, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more calming stories. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you next time.